Warsaw. April 19, 1943. A basement on Muranowska Street smells of damp concrete, machine oil, and fear. A young woman named Tosia Altman is pressing herself against a wall as Wehrmacht boots crunch the cobblestones overhead. In her hands, she holds something that looks by any reasonable measure like a piece of plumbing: a length of steel tube, a crude stamped receiver, a sideways magazine that juts out at the hip like a bent elbow. A man beside her carries one too, and 3 others are tucked behind a false partition in the room's far wall. In 36 hours, the most dramatic armed uprising of occupied Europe will begin, and these objects, these laughably simple objects, will be at its center. The weapon Tosia holds weighs just over 3 kilograms. It fires 9-millimetre pistol rounds at a cyclic rate of roughly 550 per minute. It can be stripped to its component parts in seconds without tools. It can be reassembled by a child in the dark. It costs approximately 11 shillings to manufacture. And the German soldiers who encounter it in the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, in the bocage of Normandy, in the maquis of southern France, in the shadow war of occupied Norway, those soldiers develop a very specific, very visceral dread of the sound it makes. A cheap, chattering mechanical bark, the sound of the Sten gun. To understand why the Sten matters, you have to understand what the British Army looked like in the summer of 1940. It had just evacuated 338,000 men from the beaches of Dunkirk, and in doing so had left behind virtually everything that wasn't attached to a soldier's body. Rifles, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, all of it abandoned on French sand. The army that limped home was armed with its personal weapons and precious little else. Meanwhile, across the Channel, a German invasion force was assembling with the full weight of European industrial capacity behind it. What the Steen did, in the years that followed that low moment, was something that the history books tend to understate. It did not merely arm a desperate army, it armed a continent. The Sten is the reason that partisans in a dozen occupied countries could resist. It is the reason that special operations executive networks could equip themselves from parachute drops rather than fixed supply lines. It is the reason that a woman in a Warsaw basement in April 1943 had something useful in her hands. And the reason all of that was possible comes down to one startling fact. The Sten was designed, approved, and put into mass production in an almost inconceivably short period of time, at a cost that makes modern military procurement figures look like satire. This is the story of how Britain built the ugliest, most dangerous, most consequential small arm of the Second World War, and then kept much of that story quiet for the better part of 7 decades. The problem that the Sten solved was not simply one of numbers, though the numbers were catastrophic. Following Dunkirk, British infantry units were sharing rifles. Home Guard formations, the volunteer defensive force that Churchill was simultaneously romanticizing and quietly desperate about, were drilling with broomsticks. When the War Office compiled its estimates of what a successful German invasion would require in terms of small arms resistance, the figures were almost too grim to share publicly. But the numbers problem was really a production problem, and the production problem was really an engineering problem. The Thompson submachine gun, which the United States was supplying to Britain under a series of increasingly strained financial arrangements, was a superb weapon. It was robust, reliable, accurate, and comfortable to fire. It was also machined from high-grade steel to tolerances that required skilled toolmakers operating precision equipment. The Thompson cost roughly $45 per unit to manufacture in 1940, the equivalent of roughly 850 pounds in today's money. And the American factories producing it had more orders than they could fulfill. Britain needed something different. Not just cheaper, orders of magnitude cheaper. Not just simpler, radically, almost offensively simpler. The weapon that emerged from that necessity had to be manufacturable in any machine shop in the country. It had to use standard steel tube and steel pressings, not forgings or castings. It had to be maintained by men who had been farmers or clerks or school teachers 6 months ago. And it had to be produced in millions, not thousands, within months, not years. H. 110 pounds. So the engineers who tried to solve this problem first found that existing designs, even the simpler ones, were too complex for the task. The Lanchester, which Britain had already put into limited production, was a beautiful weapon. It was also essentially hand-built by skilled craftsmen and cost nearly as much as the Thompson it was meant to replace. The Bergmann designs that had circulated in various forms across European armies were closer to what was needed, but still too refined. German forces were equipping themselves with the MP-38 and MP-40, weapons that used stamped metal components but still required a degree of precision manufacture beyond what a generalist engineering firm could achieve in a hurry. What was needed was a weapon so simple in its design principles that the engineering problem became almost trivially soluble, provided someone was willing to make the aesthetic compromises that simplicity demanded. That someone turned out to be a pair of engineers at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, working under conditions of secrecy and considerable pressure in the winter months of 1940 and early 1941. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock in Middlesex had been producing military small arms since 1816. By 1940, it was operating under wartime conditions, its production lines running continuously, its workforce expanded well beyond peacetime capacity. It was here, in an atmosphere of organized urgency, that the factory's long-serving staff would have found barely recognizable compared to the measured rhythms of pre-war production, that Major Reginald Shepard and Harold Turpin were given a specific brief. Design a submachine gun that could be manufactured to the simplest possible standard, at the lowest possible cost, and submitted for trials within weeks. The weapon they produced was completed in draft form within what post-war accounts suggest was roughly 6 weeks of intensive work, though the precise timeline remains somewhat contested in the historical literature. What is not contested is the philosophy that drove it. The Sten, the name derived from the first letters of Shepard's and Turpin's surnames, combined with the first 2 letters of Enfield, was built around a single overriding principle: eliminate every component that was not strictly necessary for the weapon to function. The result was, by any conventional measure of gunsmithing, an affront to the trade. The receiver, the central housing that in most weapons is a machined metal cylinder of some precision, was, in the Sten, a steel tube, quite literally a section of standard steel tubing, approximately 23 millimeters in diameter, drawn out and welded to a simple stamped end cap. The bolt that sat inside this tube and drove cartridges into the chamber was also roughly cylindrical, machined to moderate tolerances but not the tight specifications that most contemporary weapons demanded. The trigger mechanism was a stamped steel assembly of minimal complexity. The barrel was screwed directly into the end of the tube without the elaborate fitting processes that traditional rifle manufacture required. The magazine fed from the left side of the weapon in a configuration that looked unconventional to British eyes, trained on conventional rifle design. It held 32 rounds of 9mm parabellum ammunition, a caliber that had the useful property of also being standard to the German MP-40, which meant that a partisan or a captured soldier could, in extremis, use enemy ammunition in a Sten or vice versa. This was not an accident. The War Office specification had asked for 9mm specifically. Partly for this reason, the whole assembly weighed 3.2 kilograms unloaded, roughly equivalent to a bag of sugar, and was 76 centimeters long. It could be field stripped to its basic components without tools, using only the thumb and forefinger in under 15 seconds. Production of a single weapon required approximately 5 man-hours of labor across all its parts and assembly stages. At the peak of wartime manufacture, some estimates suggest the cost per unit dropped as low as £2.10. The equivalent today of room sources put the figure even lower. The manufacturing was distributed across dozens of firms. Stamped components came from one supplier, tubing from another, bolts from a third. Final assembly happened at multiple locations. This decentralized production model was partly a response to the Blitz. Concentrating production in one facility was a strategic liability, and partly a consequence of the sheer number of units required. The total number of Sten guns manufactured between 1941 and 1945 is estimated at somewhere between 3.7 and 4 million, though records from some of the smaller subcontractors are incomplete. The Sten's operational debut was not glorious. British soldiers who had trained on the Lee Enfield rifle, a weapon that rewarded precision and patience, were initially baffled by something that looked like it belonged under a sink. Early variants had reliability problems. The magazine design, borrowed from a German weapon and slightly modified, proved prone to feeding failures if not kept clean, and the safety mechanism on the Mark I and Mark II variants was rudimentary enough that accidental discharges occurred with enough frequency to become a grim, running joke in training establishments. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. But in the environments where the Sten was actually used, the close-quarters fighting of Normandy's hedgerows, the brutal house-clearing operations of Ortona, the ambushes of the Yugoslav partisans, and the French Maquis, its limitations mattered far less than its advantages. At ranges under 50 meters, the Sten was devastating. Its high rate of fire, modest recoil, and lightweight made it easy to handle in confined spaces. It could be fired from any position, including prone, and its side-feeding magazine meant it could be used very low to the ground, a significant advantage in the ditch and hedge warfare of Western Europe. The Special Operations Executive, the British organization charged with supporting resistance movements across occupied Europe, made the Sten the central weapon of its supply operations. It could be broken down to three main components: barrel group, magazine, and receiver with stock, that would fit easily into a cylindrical container roughly the size and shape of a large thermos flask. Hundreds of thousands were dropped by parachute across France, the Netherlands, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland. Resistance groups in Denmark built covert workshops that manufactured Sten copies from locally sourced steel. A simplified variant, the Mark II-S, fitted with an integral suppressor, was produced specifically for SOE operations, enabling assassinations and sabotage actions in conditions where noise would be fatal. The psychological effect on German occupation forces was documented in field reports captured after the war. The Sten's characteristic sound, a relatively high-pitched, irregular chatter distinct from any standard German weapon, became associated in the minds of German garrison troops with ambush, with shadow, with the specific dread of an enemy who could appear from anywhere and disappear just as quickly. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from occupied France in 1943 and 1944 make repeated reference to the Sten by name, tracking its proliferation among resistance units with an anxiety that speaks to its impact on the psychology of occupation. Germany's equivalent effort in the ultra-simple submachine gun category was the Volkssturmgewehr and the various emergency production weapons that appeared in the last 2 years of the war, but these came too late and were too desperately cobbled together to be meaningful comparisons. The more instructive comparison is with the MP-40, which was Germany's primary submachine gun throughout the conflict. The MP-40 used pressed steel components and was, by the standards of 1940, relatively cheap to produce. But its unit cost was still roughly 3 to 4 times that of a Sten. It required more skilled labor to manufacture, could not be broken down as quickly, and could not be reproduced in a small workshop by a determined partisan with access to basic machine tools. The American response to the same problem was the M3 grease gun, which appeared in 1943. The M3 was, by all accounts, a thoughtful piece of engineering, extremely reliable, somewhat cheaper even than the Sten, and firing the larger .45 ACP cartridge that American forces preferred. It addressed many of the Sten's reliability problems and was in several respects a superior weapon. But it arrived 2 years after the Sten had already been distributed in enormous quantities, and it served a different military context. The Sten had already done the essential work of arming a resistance movement across an entire continent. The M3, for all its virtues, arrived after that particular battle had been fought. The weapon had cost, in its entirety, something equivalent to the price of a decent pair of shoes, and it was, to the forces that wished to keep Tosia Altman and everyone she loved in a state of complete subjugation, a source of genuine and documented terror. Not because it was an elegant weapon, not because it was accurate, not because it represented the pinnacle of British engineering achievement or the proud legacy of a great arms tradition, but because it existed in vast numbers, in the hands of ordinary people, in every corner of a continent that had been told it had no means of resistance. The German High Command spent considerable energy identifying and attempting to disrupt the supply lines that placed Stens in the hands of partisan fighters. The psychological reports from occupation authorities across France and Poland and the Low Countries return again and again to the same theme. The enemy cannot be controlled because the enemy cannot be disarmed, and the enemy cannot be disarmed because the weapon they carry costs 11 shillings and can be made in a machine shop. This is the achievement of the Sten gun, not its lethality, not its elegance, not its technical innovation. Its achievement is the almost mathematical simplicity with which it solved the one problem that mattered in the shadow war of occupied Europe. How do you arm a continent that has been stripped of everything? You make a weapon so cheap, so simple, so reproducible, that the very logic of industrial empire cannot contain it. That ugly, awkward, brilliant length of steel tube, that 11-shilling revolution,